Photo Equipment, Part 1, General, Presentation for the Advisor, Revised, 2023, Revision 2, August. This is the first in the equipment series. General, Requirements, Lenses, Camera, Sample Kits and Purchasing Plan, and other stuff. What we will cover: intro equipment discussion, ownership, school or student, gear selection guidelines, what gear to get, human factors, legacy gear, dSLR to mirrorless change, and a caution on Canon camera names, and a summary. Intro equipment discussion. Equipment is a big subject. There are many facets to it. That is why there are so many parts to the equipment video series. I will put a short summary at the end of each video, and you can get to the summary through the chapter markers. Question: what gear should I get? Sounds simple, but it isn't. One cannot make a blanket recommendation. My requirements may be different than your requirements. Thus, my kit may or may not work for you. If you overbuy, you spent more money on gear that you won't use or use fully. If you underbuy, what you bought may or will not work, and you will have to buy more gear later to make up for the fact that your gear doesn't work. This general video is a high-level equipment discussion. It does not go into the cameras and lenses. Those are subsequent videos. The how-tos are in other videos. Emphasis is on sports, as sports creates most of the heavy camera and lens requirements. If you can do sports, you can likely do everything else. Ownership, school versus student. School ownership, pro. You can plan and manage the equipment landscape. This is because the inventory of gear is stable from year to year. You can get gear that a student or parent would typically not have. Con: buying equipment can be a significant cost to the school or the yearbook. Headache of managing the inventory of gear. You have to keep track of all your gear, who has it, and when it comes back in. Students generally do not take good care of gear that is not their own. How do you handle when a student damages or loses gear? Student ownership. Pros: no cost to the school. Students generally take better care of their own or their parents' gear. Con: it is personal property. Do not expect a student to lend their camera or lens to another student. The issue is liability. The inventory of gear will change from year to year. You never know what gear you will or will not get with the new students. The gear leaves when the student graduates or leaves the class. Students' gear will probably be general purpose. Students will probably not have the specialty gear that may be needed for low-light sports and events. And if yearbook buys a specialty lens for, let's say, a Canon, but the student has a Nikon camera, he can't use the Canon lens. Ownership. From this point on, we presume school ownership of photo gear. Student-owned gear is in addition to the school-owned gear and is not relied upon. Loss of gear. If a student loses or damages a school-owned camera or lens, how will this be handled? This will eventually happen, so plan for it now. Loss or damage could be accidental or negligent. Who pays? Is there another student responsible for the loss? I had a student with me. He asked me, if I push X into the pool with the camera, does he have to pay for the camera? I told him, you pushed him in, You're responsible. You have to pay for the camera. Does the student or his parents have to pay for the gear? Does the class absorb the loss? Do you split the cost? The school or district policy may define what happens, so you may not have a choice in the decision. This is why I do not recommend buying expensive pro-grade gear. Gear selection guidelines. Gear selection guidelines. The subjects are good enough, human factors, image stabilization, legacy gear, dSLR to mirrorless change, and Canon naming confusion. T7 versus T7i. Good enough. The vast majority of photos in the yearbook will be smaller than half a page. You do not need pro-level equipment for these smaller pictures. Non-pro gear will work just fine. Gear level, non-pro versus pro. As I've been saying, I recommend non-pro gear for the following reasons. Financial, budget. Non-pro gear is cheaper than pro gear, sometimes by a significant amount, so your budget will go farther. As I've said before, high school photographers are teenagers, not responsible adults, and it should be expected that sooner or later they will damage or lose cameras and lenses. And it has happened to us. It is easier on your budget to replace a $1,000 non-pro camera than a $4,000 pro camera. Image quality. Yearbook does not need pro-level equipment. 99.9% of the pictures will be less than 4 by 6 inches, not a 2-page spread. A 24 megapixel camera is perfectly adequate. You do not need a 50 megapixel camera. However, there are instances when a pro or semi-pro level gear will be needed. This is primarily when there is no equivalent non-pro gear for the task. For example, there is no non-pro equivalent of the 70 to 200 2.8 lens for shooting night field games. If you need that lens, the only lower cost option is a third-party lens. Gear, human factors. Something that many adults forget. Many students are of a smaller stature than adults. Some are under 5 feet tall and less than 100 pounds. The smaller students have a harder time handling the big, heavy pro gear. What may be easy for an adult to handle may be difficult for a smaller student to handle. Duration. When shooting 2 sequential football games or a quad basketball game, the photographer could be shooting for many hours. The longer you shoot, the heavier the gear feels as you get tired. Standardization. KISS. Keep it simple. It is easier for the staff to use one camera brand and model than 2 or more brands and models. A common control interface makes using different cameras easier. For example, the common control interface is the Canon T5i, T7i, and T8i. A different interface is a Canon T7i versus the 90D, or a Nikon D5600 versus the Canon T7i or the Sony A6400. Cameras using the same battery will not have the confusion and problems of cameras using different batteries, such as grabbing the wrong battery for your camera. Get to the event, try to put the battery in the camera, and find out it doesn't fit. Or trying to shove the wrong battery into the camera and getting the battery stuck in the camera. This can be an expensive repair. Or the same lens mount on the camera, A Nikon DSLR lens will not go on a Canon DSLR camera. Human factors, the lens. Here we're talking about the zoom ring turning direction. Which way do you turn the zoom ring? If it is the same or it is different. If you pick up a second lens and the zoom ring turns in the opposite direction, will that be a problem for you? This may or may not be an issue for your photographers. For me, when I'm shooting sports, it is a critical issue. I have tried once using a Sigma lens on my Nikon, and I kept turning the zoom ring in the wrong direction. After 15 minutes, out of total frustration, I just put the Sigma away. Image stabilization. Image stabilization, or IS, can be in the camera, commonly called IBIS, in-body image stabilization, or in the lens, OIS, optical image stabilization. DSLRs use optical image stabilization. Mirrorless cameras use IBIS, OIS, and sometimes both, depending on the brand and model. Note, longer lenses, such as a 75-300, need to be stabilized. But often when you buy a kit, it is the non-stabilized version that is in the kit. That is typically done to lower the selling price of the kit. The devil is in the details. You must read the spec to know what is really in the kit. Today, I do not recommend buying a long lens that does not have stabilization, unless the camera has IBIS. Legacy gear. Generally, it is best to stay with the same camera and model or upgrade within the model line. This is for ease of training. If the student can use one camera, they can use any other camera in the pool. Example, Canon T5i to T7i to T8i. If you are switching camera brands or model line, it will be difficult to support two different systems. The students may have difficulty with the two different ways of operating the camera. And you will have difficulty when you are trying to support two different cameras. Students have come up to me with a camera, with their Canon camera, and I look at it and I have to think because I am familiar with the Nikon cameras. That's what I mean by difficulty. And it will take time and money to build the second system. DSLR to mirrorless change. This is a good chance to change systems if you want to. For example, from Canon DSLR to Nikon or Sony mirrorless. Maybe you do not like the mirrorless system of your DSLR brand, and you decide, well, I don't like their mirrorless camera, so I'm going to switch brands. And there are adapters that allow you to use your particular brand X DSLR lens on your new brand Y mirrorless camera. However, you need to investigate because reliability is not guaranteed when you go cross-brand. Caution on Canon names, T7 versus T7i. The T7 is not a T7i. This is a subtle name difference that has significant practical effects for the yearbook photographers. Several yearbook advisors have been confused by the similar names. And it isn't helped because when we talk about a T7i, I have never mentioned T7i. I have always referred to the T7i as a T7. So internally, the confusion is reinforced by that particular way of speaking. The devil is in the details of the specification for each camera. As shown in this little chart of the T7i versus the T7. High ISO. T7i goes up to 25,600. The T7 only goes up to 6,400. That is a significant issue in low light photography. Maximum frame rate. T7i will do 6 frames per second. The T7 will do 3 frames per second. Half of what the T7i can do. The T7 is a poor low light camera. By low light, I mean night field and gym sports and in the theater. 3 frames per second is quite slow for shooting sports. Bottom line, the T7 is a crippled T7i. Note the T7i has been replaced by the T8i. So if you're buying new, you won't see a T7i. As I said before, the confusing part about this whole thing is people have and still refer to the T7i as a T7. Summary: ownership of equipment, school versus student. There are pros and cons to both. For these videos, we presume school ownership. It is important that you investigate your options for if and when a student loses or damages equipment. It will happen. Gear selection. Non-pro gear is perfectly adequate for yearbook and school photography. Human factors should be considered: weight, bulk, standardization, and more. New gear. It is generally best to stay with the same brand and model that you have. DSLR to mirrorless. If you want to change brands, the switch to mirrorless is probably the best time to switch. The end. Please continue to part 2, requirements, and please like and subscribe.